So as well as that pre-contact history, what is the evidence for Aboriginal presence during colonial history? There's no physical evidence. So all the evidence is in the records and also in the memories of Aboriginal people. But we do know that in exploration they played a vital role in leading people like Throsby, Hamilton Hume and Joseph Wilde, trying to find a land route from Sydney down to Jervis Bay. Cedar getting, absolutely critical in the cedar getting when this place was kind of raped and pillaged by the cedar getters. As you can see from a book called Red Gold, Aboriginal people were used to find those cedar trees. And agricultural settlement and expansion, I'm sure you all know about the history of Alexander Berry and the large Aboriginal population he had on his property. It's more difficult to find information about Aboriginal involvement in these smaller properties further up the river. But the work of people like Jim Wallace and we had a look at the Biddulph diaries, we're able to find lots of references to Aboriginal people being employed on these properties in various ways. And that's James Thompson, who was a descendant of Mary Reeby, who had the first land down here. And we also know that Aboriginal people were employed at Bundanon and an Aboriginal man lived in the single man's cottage, but I have no more information about that other than what everyone already knows. So Aboriginal people had to endure government policies of protectionism, assimilation and self-determination. But what came up, there's been a whole lot of oral history research done here in the last few years by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, extensive consultation trying to find out places of significance to do with the historical period. And it's come out really strongly, absolutely critical to the development of the social and economic fabric of this area, and particularly bean picking. So all the fringe camps set up around Nowra were basically set up to provide an easily accessible labour force for the farmers. And some of the farmers were nice and some of them weren't. But most Aboriginal people, when they talked about it, they didn't talk about it in a negative way. They talked about it in a kind of a neutral way. They were paid wages, but I think work was pretty hard. But they were on country, and that seemed to be a really important thing. The other area where they were really important was in the sawmilling. So every Aboriginal man I've ever spoken to on the south coast was involved in the timber industry in the middle of the 20th century. So their role has been really critical, and it's a bit of an untold story. So the fringe camps, Warragee, Browns Flat, Browns Hill, all those places, Silver City, Aboriginal people still talk about them today, all these camps around Nowra where the conditions were pretty bad. That picture on the left I think is at Roseby Park. So the two big Aboriginal reserves here were Roseby Park out at Orient Point and then Wreck Bay down in Jervis Bay, and also there was a little Aboriginal reserve at the northern end of 7 Mile Beach, and that's where Aboriginal people were sent after Alexander Berry got sick of them and didn't want to look after them anymore. On the other side, you've got an area that was identified during the oral history research as a place where Aboriginal people used to pick beans. I don't know exactly where it is, some of you might know. But that just gives you some idea, I guess, of just how rich this unwritten history is. And so when we think of heritage, it doesn't stop in the past, it's still there today. So when we look today, the Aboriginal population of the Shoalhaven is quite a lot higher than the average, and that's partly because of the presence of the Bomaderry Children's Home, the result of the stolen generation, the presence of Roseby Park, and also the presence of the Wreck Bay Reserve. So a lot of Aboriginal people, as Ruth said this morning, she came down here from La Perouse. That wasn't voluntarily, I can tell you. So the Bundanon Trust properties fall within the Nowra Land Council. They're based on the site of the old children's home. And they have a number of land claims over Crown land around here. And so they may end up by being neighbours or already are neighbours to the Bundanon Trust property. There's quite a few Indigenous owned and run enterprises around here, including Illaroo Farm, who are also a neighbour. And there's many Aboriginal groups apart from the Land Council, of course. There's elders groups and a whole range of different types of groups. So I won't talk about the content of the plan, but what we were aiming for is some kind of conceptual idea of how an Indigenous understanding of place and landscape could fit into the existing vision that Bundanon has, which is the bringing together the arts and the environment through Siteworks. And we thought, well, really, in many ways, that kind of reflects an Aboriginal worldview of nature and culture not really being separated, but being together, and that caring for country is a way of looking after land is like looking after people, so that you can't really separate them. And so if you bring those two together, you have something, a space and place of Bundanon which incorporates those Indigenous worldviews. There's a big Aboriginal involvement, and Bundanon's got a reconciliation plan. It's doing a lot of really good things, but we thought it could value add to that by having a more active involvement of local Aboriginal people in actually caring for this land, and through the Catchment Management Authority, but also through Andrew's visions. Andrew's visions involve all sorts of things on the ground that Aboriginal people could be involved in, like reforestation, like weed removal. And that's a way of getting people back on country, back to the land, and feeling that they're contributing to looking after this place. Our recommendations also acknowledge that looking after heritage can't be separated from looking after people.